Thank you. Well, you guys were discussing um, Gómez Dávila's influences, Haman, and that's like the usual approach to his work, which is the one that I also took when I was writing my doctoral dissertation. I mean, we all know that Pascal and the German reactionaries and other types of thinkers that he aligned with are his main influences. Um, what Dr. Kinzel was saying about about his Catholicism and the way when you trust Christ, well, I mean, systematic philosophy is just not that attractive. Well, that's also Pascal's approach, right? And so it's clear that he has certain affinities with reactionary thinkers and Catholic thinkers, and even the Protestant reactionaries from the 18th and early 19th centuries. That's all very clear, but we also have to take into account that Gómez Dávila was a very ironic thinker. He was deeply ironic, and he's not like the usual reactionary that we all have in our minds. And he takes some distance from reactionaries sometimes, and he approaches his adversaries in a very productive way. And he has some things in common with them. And so my point is he takes some distance from reactionaries, some from certain reactionaries, and he approaches his adversaries and has some things in common with them. So, for example, in one of his scholia, he says um, that most kings have been as mediocre as presidents, right? So it's like the opposite of the usual monarchic spirit that we find in many reactionaries. And at the same time, he has some things in common with Hegel and with Freud and with other thinkers that we usually think are his adversaries. So today I'd like to just, introduce some commonalities between Gomez Dávila and Freud, which is one of his adversaries, or at least, I mean, maybe that's not the precise word I'm looking for. Maybe I'm thinking of thinkers that are on the opposite side of Gomez Dávila. And I'd like to show you that even though even though Gomez Dávila and Freud are obviously very different, it's very productive to think of the things that they have in common, precisely because of what Dr. Kinzel was saying and what Mr. Mosebach was saying, because he read the Germans and he understood them very well. And even though he disagreed with a lot of things they said, he disagreed with Freud and he disagreed with Hegel, there are some things that they share, and that's also an important part of understanding Gomez Dávila. So very quickly, I'd like to present a couple of things that I think Gomez Dávila and Freud had in common. So like I was saying, there's a scholia of Gomez Dávila that says Helvetius, Holbach, Sade, Bentham, Marx, Freud, Sartre, la pléyade de arcángeles sombríos, el canon clásico de mis imposibilidades absolutas. So for those of you that don't speak Spanish, he's basically saying that Freud is part of a series of thinkers that are an absolute impossibility for him. So they are opposites. Freud stands for modern science, problematically, but Freud thinks that he's doing science, rigorous science. Gomez Dávila stands on the side of theological thinking, of religion, of tradition. Freud is an atheist who thinks that God is dead, basically, and it's a projection of our relationship to our dads. And Gómez Dávila takes God seriously, and we know so because he says so explicitly. We should take religion seriously. So they are not on at first glance anyway, thinkers that have a lot of things in common, but maybe that's not as unproblematic as it seems at first. There is a problem that they share, at least. There are many, but and there's some scholia that I think
I
could
think
have
that's
been written by Freud. But there is a problem that unites them, which is the problem of the transit from nature to culture. And in both thinkers, God is at the center of that problem. So I would like to remind you what Freud says in Totem and Taboo about that problem. And I'd like to remind you what Gómez Dávila says in Textus and Scholia as well about that problem to see what they have in common. So, the Freudian thesis, it's quite well known. It says that at the origin of religion, you find totemism, and in totemism, each clan has a totemic animal. That animal is subject to taboos, so you cannot kill it or touch it. So, for example, let's say that your totemic animal in your clan is the eagle. Well, you cannot touch or kill an eagle because it's the animal of your clan. But Freud says, these clans in religious ceremonies kill and eat their totemic animal, and he finds that quite interesting and surprising. And he says, after the banquet, the clan members cry and lament what they did. And after they cry, there comes a celebration. So what gives, asks Freud, his thesis to understand this very weird religious ritual in which the clan eats an animal, cries after they eat the animal, and then celebrates after the killing and eating of the animal, is that the totemic animal is a substitute of the father. What father, asks Freud? Well, he proposes the idea of the primal horde. And, before the universe of culture, there was a primal horde in which the father monopolized all women. The males were expelled. Um, so Freud asks the question, how did this primal horde become a totemic tribe? So one day the expelled brothers become allies and they killed and devoured the father. But so the result is contradictory because instead of having sexual access to their mothers and sisters, the brothers um lament the death of the father, and at the same time adopt the father's prohibition even more intensely than before. Before when the father was alive, the only thing that standed between the women, sorry, and the brothers was the power of the father. But after the father dies, the prohibition, the incest prohibition becomes stronger because it becomes interjected by the band of brothers. So the band of brothers had an ambivalent relationship with their father. They were happy because they killed the father stand that stood in the way of the brothers and the women, but at the same time they regretted killing their father because they loved him. So the band of brothers became full of guilt. They developed a really strong sense of guilt. That's Freud's thesis. So religion would emerge from this sense of guilt of the brothers, and they would try to get rid of their guilt by obeying their dead father. So that's why I was saying that the incest prohibition becomes really strong. It becomes a real law, a cultural law, after the band of brothers killed their father. So the father would become a totemic animal and eventually God. So the ritual, the religious ritual of killing the totemic animal is just a repetition of the original primordial crime, right? The parricide. So, according to Freud, and this is the point to which I was getting at, according to Freud, religion starts with a rebellion against the father, right? Which creates a sense of guilt. And there's an ambivalent relation with the father, right? The band of brothers love and hate the father. So, like I said, the universe of culture rests on that primal patricide, and we all share the guilt of that crime. I'm not saying that Freud was right. I'm not saying he was wrong. I'm just trying to show what he has in common with Gómez Dávila, and this is it. So in Textos, Gómez Dávila also asks himself, how did humans become humans? Like, how did they stop being animals and start being humans? And he says, look, there are lots of things that unite us with animals that we have in common with them. We have in common intelligence, astuteness, social organization, but none of them separates us from them. Like, lions are very astute. They think strategically. He says, ants have very complex forms of social organization. That's not what divides us from that's not what separates us from animals. What separates us from animals is something that only humans have, which is access to God. So we become human when God appears, when there's something that doesn't belong to this world and that intrudes in our lives and like messes our lives up, which is also something in common with Freud, because according to Freud, being in the universe of culture is being like we're never comfortable in the universe of culture. And Gómez Dávila says, when God enters human reality, everything changes because you start doing things that are not necessarily useful to our survival, but which are important religiously. And that's not, those rituals are not conducive necessarily to our well-being, but we still have to do them. To animal well-being, I'm saying. In religious rituals, we sometimes do weird things. And so God transforms it, it transforms animal life into human life, and it gives human life value. It orders human life. It introduces the good and the beautiful. So human society also rests on religion. Humanity itself rests on religion. But like, so they have that in common. According to Freud, religion is at the center of um, of culture, of the universe of culture. But Gómez Dávila and Freud also have in common the fact that we have an ambivalent relation to God. So according to Gómez Dávila, we also rebel against the Father, against God. We have a tendency to rebel, and that's part of Catholicism, of course. But Gómez Dávila emphasizes them over and over, because we are full of pride and we want to become like our Father, our celestial Father. We want to become like God, which is of course the main problem of democracy. We want to become gods. But Gómez Dávila doesn't stop there. He also says, humans also love God, and that's why religions uh, teach us how to love God, and they instruct us to love God, and that's their main purpose. That's why he says, that cathedrals weren't made for tourism, to increase tourism. That wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was religious. And so Gómez Dávila loves God, and Christians love God, but at the same time, we are full of pride. Like, humans in general are full of pride, and they want to become like God. So they want to kill God and be like him, which is exactly what Freud is saying in his work. That's what primal humans did. The band of brothers hated the father. They also loved him, and so that ambivalent relation to the father is at the beginning of religion. And so Gómez Dávila and Freud are opposite thinkers. They have lots of things that separate them, but at the same time, there are things that unite them, even though they think about these problems differently, of course, because I don't think Gómez Dávila would accept that at the origin of religion is parricide and so on. He thinks that God is a real entity. Like, he wouldn't say that, like Freud, that that God, sorry, is a projection of our dad and so on. He wouldn't accept that. But at the same time, there are things that unite them, and you can also see them see that, sorry, in the case of Gómez Dávila and Marx. They're completely opposite in many ways, but Marx and Gómez Dávila also shared some things in the same way. I mean, my point is, Gómez Dávila ironizes reactionary theses, and at the same time he adopts some Marxian theses explicitly, and it's amazing when he does, like when he says, maybe civilization is actually just this superstructure of feudalism and so on. Like he's being an ironic thinker, of course, but it means, I mean, when he says those things, he's incorporating Marx ironically into his own thinking, and at the same time he separates from some reactionary thinkers, and so that makes Gómez Dávila much more interesting and much more intelligent than the typical reactionary thinkers that just take themselves too seriously and reject absolutely the thought of thinkers like Freud and Marx. So that's basically what I wanted to say. Like I wanted to suggest that just reading the readers, the thinkers, sorry, that Gómez Dávila had a lot in common with, doesn't cut it. Like we also have to take into account Gómez Dávila's adversaries in order to really see what he was getting at. I don't know if you agree with me, but that's what I wanted to say today.